Hi, my name is Neka, and last year I read 30 books. I read 31 books and over 11,000 pages, which is the most I've ever done in a year. I started off the year coming off of a romantasy vibe, and I came into the year with that because my first 5 reads of the year were all romantasy books. The first 3 were the Once Upon a Broken Heart series by Stephanie Garber. I thought it was really cute. With romantasy, you're not really reading it to look at the pinnacle of writing. At its simplest form, a romantasy book should entertain me. It should leave me feeling like I just came off this wild adventure. This series did that for me. I liked it. I thought the 3rd book was kind of messy and not well done. Moving on to the next series, the Acotar series. I have a problem with the Acotar series. I can never get past book 2. This has to be my 3rd time trying. I tried it when it first came out in 2017 and I liked book 1. I loved book 2. Could not stand book 3, and it's happening again this year where book 1 was okay. I really just read book 1 to get to book 2, and my plan was to progress throughout the whole series, but unfortunately I got 40% into book 3 and I just couldn't do it anymore. I think it's just that I've read so much romantasy in my life that the plots just feel a bit too cliche, a bit too cringe. Like I just don't want to put myself through it, and in this case I took myself out of my own misery. Okay, now we're moving into the more exciting stuff. I'm 23 years old. I don't want to keep reading romantasy for the rest of my life. Also, I graduated from university in 2023. I need something to fill the academic shaped hole in my heart, and that can be through my reading. So I began to diversify my interests, and I started with The Silent Patient. I'm not a thriller girl, I'm still not, but this book, it's a very popular one. Some of you may have already read it, so you know already. It's just, I love when a book can surprise me. The plot of this book truthfully was a treat. It was so surprising. I did not expect the twist at the end. It was just so well done. Our next book, I actually have a physical copy of, and it's All Our Yesterdays by Joel H. Morris. Where do I start with this one? It's not a bad book. It kept my interest throughout. I read this in like 2 days. I was reading in the hopes that something would happen, and at the end, nothing ever really did happen, and the things that did happen were just kind of lukewarm, so I was quite disappointed. This is a retelling of the story of Macbeth. It's a prequel to what happens in Shakespeare's Macbeth, told from the perspective of Lady Macbeth. But in the description of this book, I didn't necessarily understand that it was a prequel. That might just be my fault, but I thought it was at least taking place somewhat during the Shakespeare play. It doesn't at all. So to be honest, it didn't even need to be tied to the Macbeth plot because it didn't feel that grounded in Shakespeare's Macbeth. Aside from some characters that you can recognize, but like it could honestly be a standalone story. It might be a thing with Lady Macbeth because from what I've heard from reviews of other Lady Macbeth retellings, they're not that strong either. So I'm like, maybe we should just leave Lady Macbeth alone. Maybe we should just leave her backstory alone. The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon was my next read. This is a huge ass book. The beginning of this book, it can feel like a slog just because it's a fantasy book set in its own universe, and with fantasy there's a lot of world building that has to happen, and with a big book like this it makes it even more intimidating. And once I got into it, it was such a pleasure. Every time I opened the book I was so excited. I'm like, what's going on? And it has such an amazing cast. The main romance in the book is a lesbian romance. The fantasy world building was beautiful and I just felt so immersed. This next book I read for a book club reading, Minor Details by Adania Shibli. Of course, we all know what's happening with Israel and Palestine, and I feel like it's so easy to see these things as statistics. One thing I really like about this book is that it really brings you into the moment. It really makes you empathize with the minor details of what's going on, things you would not even have thought about. Being segregated into neighborhoods, not being able to travel, living every day in constant fear. The author does an amazing job of capturing that in a way that doesn't feel like it's forcing you to feel empathy. She's really just sharing the story, and I think the story is especially important in today's context. The next read, The Ramayana by Ramesh Menon, and I'm going to be reviewing Ramesh Menon's retelling of the story more than I would be reviewing the actual story because it's a very classic story. It's an old story, and I feel like I can't critique it the way I would a book written in today's age because its purpose goes beyond just storytelling. I will say I really love the way Ramesh Menon retells these stories. I read his retelling of the Mahabharata and I loved it. I was so hooked to that, and that's actually what made me want to read the Ramayana, because I know these have really inspired a lot of literary works, including Star Wars, I think. This is kind of like your classic good vs evil, and you know good is going to win. This next book is very popular, Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee, and I think it was on the New York Times Best Books of the 21st Century, which, can we announce this clearly at this point in time? I don't think so. But if a book does deserve a spot on that list, Pachinko is one of those books. I remember reading this and just feeling so immersed in the story. You know how most books, on the last page there's a bit of blank space at the bottom, so you know like at least either another chapter is coming or we're done? Like, this is how the last page of this book looks. Like, it's literally to the end. So I genuinely thought that there was another page after this, and I flipped over and I saw acknowledgements and I was like, what's happening? We're done? wait, I'm not done though. I want to hear more. I want to keep going with this family until the end of time. It follows this family as they navigate marginalization by Japan on Korea, and migration, and being second-class citizens in another country, and what that does to your personal identity. I thought it was amazing because even though I'm not Korean, I can relate as a Nigerian, and just my personal thoughts on how colonization has impacted the way we see ourselves. I could relate to those themes in the story. There's a show of this on Apple TV, and they changed so much about the book. It's not a bad show. I think either you watch the show or you read the book, because they changed quite a bit in the show that makes it kind of be like, oh, but I like how it was in the book. This is In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. It's a non-fiction book. It's her memoir, and she details the time when she lived with her abusive ex in a house together and the damage that did to her and her way out of that relationship. It's not a linear storytelling. Instead, she approaches this as if she is analyzing it academically almost. She calls the house that she lived in with her ex the dream house. So each chapter is like dream house as theme. So for example, dream house as hypochondria. It's just really interesting the way she went about it. I thought it was really clever. Another book I read that I don't have a physical copy of because I gave it out, it's called The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. If you've been wanting romantasy that's elevated, this is the book for you. It follows this scholarly maid in medieval Spain during the Inquisition era who discovers she can do magic, and like she enters this power play with all these nobles, and there's an immortal love interest. My favorite thing about this book is the wittiness of the writing and of the characters. There's such a dry humor in the book that's so easy to appreciate and love. It literally captured my heart. Like, I cried when I finished the book. I cried. I was like, I can't believe this is over. Moving on to our next book, second place, my first Rachel Cusk book. The bookstore I go to, they actually recommended this for me. Rachel Cusk is a very introspective person, and you can tell through the way she writes. She writes in a very introspective way. She writes like someone who is constantly peering past the surface into what lies beyond that, and like observing. And you can tell in her writing, like, this is a small book, but it's very profound. This woman invites an artist to stay in her cottage over a summer, and he basically wreaks havoc in their life through some psychological mind games. Our next book on the list is one I got as a book swap, so it doesn't have a cover, but it's Stay True by Hua Su. And this was very seriously recommended to me by so many of my friends. It was really good. I thought it was an amazing memoir. It's not something I would have picked up for myself. Hua Su really covers the feeling of nostalgia, of friendship. This is really a love letter to the 90s, to California in some ways, to art, and to friendship. This year was the year of trying new things for me, clearly, because I also got to read Miss Toni Morrison for the first time this year. This is Beloved by Toni Morrison. The writing in this book is some of the most beautiful writing I've ever come across. The storytelling is amazing. It follows the story of Sethi, a slave that escaped from her plantation and ends up killing one of her kids during that process of trying to escape and emancipate herself from slavery. That child comes back to haunt her and her family. It really shows that the true horror lied in the circumstances, i.e. slavery, that let this type of thing happen. And it was very hard to read at times, reading about the violence that was put upon Black people, but definitely a very, very necessary story to read. It's one of my favorite books from this year. I went on to read another Toni Morrison book after this, and that was Sula by Toni Morrison, and I didn't love it as much as I loved Beloved, but it was still amazing. It follows these two girls, Sula and Nelly, or Nell. Let me find her name. Her name is Nell. So Nell becomes very straight-laced. Sula grows up to be very very like free and wild. I think the parallels between them is very interesting. They definitely seem like two people that experienced the same thing and had two very different approaches to that. One thing that Toni Morrison shows really well is like the implications of a society that restricts women. Another book that I think a lot of people didn't like, surprisingly, was YN by Esther Yee. This book has pretty low ratings on any website you'd see. Don't be deceived by that. It's a great book. It's satire. Like, if you don't understand it's a satire and absurdist story, you may pick it up and be like, what am I reading? It's basically about this German-Korean copywriter that falls in love with a K-pop band and gives up everything to follow them to South Korea. I picked this up because I used to be a fan fiction girly. I was a One Direction stan. I would read a lot of fan fictions. This was giving me those vibes. But like, make it philosophical, and that's where the satire comes in. It trips you into thinking, yes, it's satire about this fangirl, but then she's so philosophical in her thinking, and the book makes a lot of points on yearning and unrequited love. Another book I read was 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. I just wanted to read a story that was about black love and black romance because we need more of those, and Tia Williams is doing the Lord's work. Now, would I read this book again? No, but I like the idea behind it, but it just wasn't for me. The romance between them, I just don't think it was executed very well. It was still really good. Like, I loved the spicy scenes, but I was just kind of like, okay, we get it. Like, you guys would die for each other. And I think it's that. I feel like some authors kind of skip that chemistry building and go straight to the like, I'll die for you. Like, I would kill for your mind. And I'm like, this isn't believable. You're giving creepy. Like, I don't know you. I also tried this very, very short story, like 30 pages on Amazon Stories, and it was called The 6 Deaths of the Saints. It was very well done, amazingly written. I always admire when an author can write a good story concisely because it's not easy. Another book I read this year was Bunny by Mona Awad, and this book has inspired me. I now want to do an MFA program, maybe meet a girl gang that are into the occult and sacrificing bunnies to make their ideal man. Like, that sounds like the vibe, and that's what this book is about. Reading the book can feel like you're on an acid trip. It can be very disorienting, but I think it served the purpose of the book very well, and I personally thought it was genius. I loved it. Next is Lapvona by Otessa Mosvek, and y'all lied to me because I thought this book was going to be either very scary or very, very gross, and it was gross. But it wasn't scary at all, and it wasn't as gross as I expected it to be. And we followed this deformed boy called Marek in a village called Lapvona. I loved that misadventure vibe where like I wasn't necessarily reading for a plot. I was literally just here for the vibes. Untamed by Glennon Doyle. I actually started reading this in 2023. A memoir of Glennon Doyle's. She details how she left her husband for a woman, and I thought it was very interesting in the way she showed a lot of things. I think at first I was getting a lot from what she was saying, but after a while I was like, okay, we're still going. And I felt like the things she was saying, we've heard it before. This is a book that could have actually been a lot smaller and could have still been as impactful. If you don't want to read this, you can actually listen to her podcast. The way she speaks on it is very similar to how she writes in here, so you kind of get the same experience. The next 3 books I'm going to talk to you about were all back-to-back bangers. Let's start with number 1, Butter Honey Pig Bread by Francesca Ekwuyasi. I'm Nigerian, so I always love reading books from Nigerian authors. It was really just uncovering the ties between this family and the ways in which they were hurting and how their lives had panned out, and I was really interested in the characters themselves. I loved that there was an LGBTQ character who is a lesbian, and it's something that's not spoken about a lot in Nigerian culture. You know, being gay, being lesbian is not acceptable. I love that this author touched on it and showed how a woman was living her best life across the world and even in Lagos as a lesbian. I just love a good family drama or a book that explores family dynamics, and I think this book does that really well. I loved reading it. The next one I read was I Who Have Never Known Men. It was really good. I actually didn't want to pick it up at first because I'm not the biggest science fiction girl. I've never really been into science fiction, but I would actually say this book is more philosophical than scientific. It doesn't answer any scientific questions necessarily, but it really delves into what it means to be in community, loneliness, isolation, searching for the meaning of life, the women in the bunker searching for an exit or an escape or for answers for their world. I found that very similar to how we search for God in our world and how we're still kind of searching for answers and we don't know anything as concrete. So I thought it was very philosophical. Butter by Asako Yuzuki. This book was lent to me by a coworker. It was so delicious. A Japanese woman who was convicted of killing 4 men and she was known for cooking them lots of delicious food. This journalist decides to investigate and see what really happened. You might go into it thinking it's going to be an investigation into murder, but it's actually a lot more about women's societal roles in Japan, the way women's bodies in Japan and their relations to food, how that's so managed by society, and food in itself, how food is an art form, how food is a communal thing, and how we've kind of lost that in some ways. It made me want to have some buttery ramen noodles. Moving on to our last 4 books, and 2 of them I have the hard copies. The first is To Paradise by Hanya Yanagihara. I've had this book since 2022. I got it as a Christmas gift because I loved A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. This was her next work after that. Her writing does not disappoint in this book. I just think some other things do. So this book follows 3 different stories, one set in an alternate reality of the 1800s where the US was split into 2 countries after the Civil War and the Northern Territories decided gay marriage be legalized and what that was like. The second story follows a boy who runs away from his kingdom in Hawaii to New York, and it follows the story of his family. The third story is set in a distant future where epidemics and pandemics have ravaged the world. And in each story, it follows the same names of David, Charles, and Edward, and Eden, and some other names, but each story has like the same sorts of names and the same types of dynamics between characters. So it's really interesting in that way. What I didn't like is it tends to slog on, and this was a critique some people had for A Little Life, was that it had too many pages. I didn't feel that way, but I do feel that way about this book. The next book I read is The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson, and this actually is my favorite read of 2024. It's about Maggie Nelson and her journey into motherhood with her partner who is trans and gender fluid, and exploring that change within her partner and then the change within herself as a mother too. But like beyond that, it's also just Maggie Nelson speaking Maggie Nelson's mind, which honestly I could read forever. This was the first book I've read that calls itself an auto theory, where she really mixes her thoughts and things that happen in her life with theories from other people. It can kind of read like an academic text, but I liked it for that reason. I liked how I was thinking when I read this book. This book really opened my mind up to thinking about things in a new way. If you look through my copy, like I have so many highlights and annotations, like oops, as you can see in this page. This book is not a coherent line, it's more of a stream of consciousness on her part, and it just is amazing in the way she writes about it, and I really just want to live in her mind and hear her speak all the time. My last 2 reads of the year, first is a non-fiction called Existential Kink by Carolyn Elliott, and I really liked this. I thought it was very different from other self-help books. It was preaching something completely different, which is that we actually desire everything that happens to us in our lives, and that might be conflicting for some people, but I thought it was very resonant for me. It really helped expand the way I think. And then Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Ajay Brain. This book was the perfect way to end 2024 for me. It follows these 2 characters, Larissa Thorwar and Hurricane Stacks, as they navigate the penal system. They have these gladiator style games that they do with the prisoners, and in exchange for fighting you get your freedom. The author is making a lot of points about the penal system in America, and he actually has footnotes under everything with references to like stuff in real life, and I thought that was just so genius. It almost feels like each chapter is its own short story, even though it's following a story, but I feel like that was necessary in order to really cover the different ways in which the penal system really is an act of violence on Black bodies in America. Those were my reads. Thank you so much for watching.